The game of snooker is over 100 years old, but the game as we know it today owes its universal popularity almost entirely to this man. Joe Davis, OBE, the Sultan of Snooker and the Emperor of Pot.
Yeah, I was born on a place called Whitwell, on the borders of Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire. And we didn't reside there very long because my father and mother took a public house at another place, a place called Whittington Moor, about 2 miles outside of Chesterfield. And the pub was called the Queen's Hotel. It was very fortunate for me because it happened to have a full-size billiard table there, for no reason at all other than the fact that it was there. And this is where I started to play, at the ripe old age of 11. Well, of course, I went on playing and playing and playing, and at the age of 12, I made a 100 break at billiards, of course. Billiards was the only thing played pretty well in those days, very little snooker. And then, when I was 13, I won the local amateur billiards championship. Again, I made a century break in the final of that. So I was doing pretty well. It wasn't for any inspiration from my father. I don't think my father ever made a 20 break in his life at billiards, and certainly never at snooker, or anything like it. So it was very fortunate, and also fortunate that the billiards table there had a false floor, about three inches higher than it normally would have been. That enabled me to start playing at such an early age. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to reach the table properly. So, you see, fate played one or two parts there that enabled me to become a billiards and snooker player. And my father, yes, was a terrible gambler, a great sportsman altogether. And he was up to all sorts of tricks and games and fun and whatever. And he was a great character. I think he arrived on the scene a bit early in his life because many of the things that he introduced then have become, of course, quite big events. He started a cinema, for instance, when we were at the pub. He had an outside staircase built, which led to the club room that was known in those days. And there he started a cinema, silent films and so on. My sister used to play the piano to the silent films in those days. My mother was a great worker, and she was always looking after the pennies, of course, as well. Because my father was very able and capable of spending the money. So someone had to take care of it. So my mother, she was barmaid, she was box office attendant, and everything that went with it. And, of course, kept the house going in general. Mr. Ernest Rudge. Oh, great chap he was, too, a great benefactor in my life. He was the man that taught me to play, originally, or in the early days of my life. And when my father joined the army in the First World War, we had to leave the public house, and Ernest Rudge took me under his wing. He not only continued to teach me to play, but he taught me many other things in life, which I'm very happy to say have stood me in good stead ever since. He organized several matches in his hall in Chesterfield. He had a billiard hall there and a little match hall. And he engaged the leading professional players to come and give matches, play matches there, and give exhibitions. And I, as a schoolboy, used to get permission from my headmaster to go and act as spot boy. In other words, I walked round the table picking out the balls and throwing them back to the player. This was a great benefit to me, because not only was I seeing all of the good things could be done on the table, but it encouraged me tremendously.
I first came in contact with Joe Davis when he was 14 years of age. I was playing Tom Rees, the Old Town Pro, at Chesterfield. And we got news that there was a very fine boy player. And his dad said, "Will you watch him practicing?" So the next morning, Tom Rees and I slid into the hall and watched this boy for just about half an hour, and we slid out, and he didn't know he'd been under scrutiny. So we told the manager of the hall that he was going to be a champion. And he said, "Not the way he stands. It's ridiculous. I've tried to get him to stand properly, like Rees and you do, but it's of no avail." So then, of course, I started to tell him to leave him alone. Leave the boy alone, he's a natural.
It was well known to me in my early days that I had an odd sort of appearance in my eye, not in appearance, but in the effect of my right eye. And sometime before I realized it, but it did come about finally when George Gray, the Australian player, was asked to see me play. And he said, "I don't think this boy will ever be very good because he sights with one eye." And he tried to get me to line up so that I played as a two-eyed stance, but I couldn't get back to it at all. And so I had to revert to my one-eyed stance, which is my left eye. And that's the way I used it ever since. It was pretty good, that left eye of mine. The right wasn't very good, but the left was very useful. First appearance I ever made was at Thurston's in London, Leicester Square, the very famous hall. I was invited to take part in a St. Dunstan's charity show. And my uncle took me down to London, and my first game there was against a man named Aiken, who was Scottish champion. He was only 150 up at billiards, each of the games, and I was to receive 100 starts. And my first visit to the table, I made 147, strangely enough, the same break that I made in the maximum score of the snooker. But so I was just 3 short of making a run out on the first appearance that I played at Thurston's Hall. Anyway, I got as far as the semi-final and was finally beaten by a man named Lawrence, Fred Lawrence, who was a great competitor of mine in the Midlands. But that was my first appearance at the famous Thurston's Hall. Well, I didn't get paid anything for that. This was purely a charity thing, so it cost my father a few pounds to send his brother and myself to London. But I did get engagements after this, and this put me onto the foundation for the game, because I got wonderful publicity following this first appearance in this very famous hall. And I think that must have set the seal on my professional life. Well, this is the cue that cost the fabulous amount of 7 and 6pence. And I played with it from the time I bought it in 1923 until I retired in 1963. So I had it for 40 years, and I've still got it, of course. Not using it very much now, but it did serve a very useful purpose. And I bought it from a friend of mine at the Parish Church Institute, where I used to go. and play occasionally. And Willie Smith had advised me to get a new cue. I'd been playing for a little while with another cue, which I thought was wonderful, but it apparently wasn't. And Willie Smith said, well, you'd better break that up and buy yourself a really good cue. But this was already a second-hand cue when I bought it. And as I say, I've had it now 50 years. But it was a second-hand cue then. How old it was then, I don't know. But well, the man's dead since. Otherwise, I would have gone back and said I hadn't had very good value for my money. But 7 and 6pence was a fair sum at that time. I was playing Tom Newman in the Billiards Championship in Manchester. And we left our cues and cases in the dressing room, where we had alongside the hall. And as we went to play the opening session, the second afternoon, Tom Newman's cue and case there, but mine missing. Anyway, we searched everywhere and got the caretaker and so on, but no sign of the cue anywhere. Finally, we rang the police, got the police to come round, wondered what had happened, and everybody searched the building. And I had to go on eventually because time had arrived when opening of the session. And Tom Newman lent me his second cue. It was no use to me, it was so different to my own. I was unable to play at all. I mean, I might have been a complete novice. But it was only at the end of the afternoon that the caretaker in this hall was going round to stoke up in the boiler house, and he found the cue case reared up in the corner. Not damaged in any way, but just left there to prevent me going on using my own cue.
I was playing him a week's match at Leicester Square Hall many, many years ago, and we got to the Friday afternoon session, and Joe, as he sometimes did, got a little irate at missing a comparatively easy shot, banged his cue on the floor, whereupon 3 inches of the butt flew off. Now, this wouldn't have made too much difference, except that he was going to South Africa on the following Monday, and his cue had to be rushed off to the Stradivarius of cue makers, one McDonough, for repairs for Joe to go off on the Monday, which meant that on Saturday, Joe was without his famous cue. He borrowed every cue at Leicester Square and eventually finished up playing with my second cue, and he managed to win 1 frame out of the 12 that we played. So this was obviously one of the worst days that Joe would want to remember.
I think that one of the most exciting moments of my life when I arrived back in Chesterfield, having won the Billiards Championship in 1928. My father had stayed on in London to see my finish of my championship against Tom Newman, and we travelled back to Chesterfield, at least not me realising that there'd be anyone at all awaiting our arrival. But there was a tremendous crowd, and the streets were lined with people. Well, great excitement. Wonderful day for me.
I was only a boy of 13 and very interested. The whole population of the town was very interested. You see, Chesterfield was only a very small town, and people was very delighted at the town having a world champion. And it seemed that the whole of the population of Chesterfield turned out to welcome him home. The welcome was fantastic, what they gave him, and I recall it as a small boy so vividly. And the station when he got off the train, the approach to the station, the square, it was fantastic. There must have been 4,000 or 5,000 people there.
Walter Lindrum, of course, came from Australia in 1929. With a wonderful reputation, and not only was it a reputation, it was a performance that was almost unbelievable. Well, I had to suffer some of this because he made his highest break of 4,137. That's a billiards break, if you please, and he made that against me. So I sat there watching this for, well, 3 sessions. I never was able to take a shot. There he was, going on and on and on and on. And, of course, far too good for me, playing far too well for me in those days. And it was the only time, of course, the only man that beat me in the championship after I won it for the first time in 1928. I never lost it again, except to Walter Lindrum. Willie Smith, great character. Yes, he was world champion. He only played in it twice, and he won it twice. I think it was 1920 or 21 and 1923. He won the championship on each occasion. Then, for some business or commercial reasons, he never played in it again. He made a break of well over 2,000 and several breaks in 1600s and so on. He was a great player, an all-round player, whereas Lindrum was played a lot of top-of-the-table and nursery cannons. But Willie Smith was a real all-round player, most entertaining player, aggressive type, and we didn't always see eye to eye. We did latterly, and we became very, very dear friends, and we still are.
One of my first recollections of Joe in connection with the game would be when I was knocking the balls around on the full-size table around that probably 9 or 10 years of age, something like that. I could hardly reach, and he came to watch what I was doing, and the first recollection of him speaking to me was him saying, "Take that bloody grin off your face," you know, which was typical of Joe then and as he would be today if he was giving advice to anyone.
I always considered Fred one of the most outstanding snooker players you could ever wish to see anywhere. Fred's technique in the game was quite outstanding. He had a stance and a delivery. It was almost like the fourth bridge. He was so solid and never moved an eyelid or a muscle when he was standing at the table, which was terribly important.
Well, I'm sure he must have been an inspiration that I think is almost certain. Help? No, I'd query that. Because Joe never quite, or shall I say, in my earlier days, didn't approve of my attitude towards the game because it contrasted so differently to his own, which he was 100% dedicated to the game. He was very determined, and of course, temperamentally, he was suited to that approach. But in my case, it was different. I was possibly as determined as he was to be successful, but I approached it in a different way, which he misunderstood at that particular time. Later on, when I proved to him, without any shadow of doubt, that I could play, and in fact it was possible for me to beat him, that he then realized that I had advantages that he hadn't thought of.
Of course, Fred suffered considerably by being my brother, in as much as they always said, well, of course, you're playing very well, Fred, but of course never like Joe, you see, which of course Fred had to suffer this, I'm sorry to say, on many, many occasions, and this was all wrong, and because Fred was a great player.
I was the only player ever to beat Joe on level terms. No one else ever did that. And this, of course, to me, I fully expected that the public and everyone, all the followers of the game, would accept it as such. But that wasn't, unfortunately, the case.
He was the only player to have beaten me on level terms over a series of games, matches. I don't know whether it was once, twice, but Fred did beat me, and he was the only player that ever did when we played on level terms over a series of games.
They assumed that because we were brothers that he must have let me win, you know, which of course anyone knowing Joe, that was the last thing that he would ever do.
Well, I first played Joe in the 1930s. Late 1930s, and he was a most dominant character. And Joe, what can you say about Joe Davis? He he was a man that commanded the room and used to frighten you when you got in the room. And he was a fantastic player. I met him in both championships, the snooker championship and the billiards championship. And naturally, he knocked me out of both championships. He played fantastic snooker. In 3 days, he made 4 or 5 century breaks against me, which, of course, was out of this world in those days. And without any practice of billiards whatsoever, he played solidly at snooker for a year, and I met him in the UK Billiards Championship semi-final, and the first pop to the table on the Tuesday afternoon, he made 1,000 break. Well, that's enough to frighten any player off the table. It didn't frighten me, because it was one of the finest games I've ever played. I managed to average 50 for a week. And imagine averaging 50 for a week against a person like Davis, and I still lost the game by 8,000.
I met him first when he did his act at the London Palladium. I didn't meet him at the beginning, but I was working in another show for the same management, Jack Hilton. When I was asking Jack about who was in the show and so on, I said, who's the specialty? And Jack said, Joe Davis. I said, Joe Davis? Never heard of him. I said, what does he do? What is he, a wire walker or something? And Jack was furious. He said, he's been world's billiards and snooker champion for the last 30 years, undefeated, etc., etc., etc. So I said, well, that may be, but what's he going to do on the stage? So Jack said, well, you wait and see.
The stage was the most interesting part of my playing career. I had conceived this idea of putting an act on the stage, and then I got an enormous mirror made so that it could be erected at the back of the table, so that the people sitting in the stalls could just look up into the mirror and see the play going on, whereas the circle they could look straight down onto it, you see. And I had all this constructed and all my engagements made when off I went to South Africa for a tour, thinking that I would come back to London and open up my music hall engagements. But to my great surprise and horror, everybody else's horror, war broke out whilst I was out in Africa, in this place you read of today called Umtali. And that's the night I played the day before war was declared. The stage appearances were most interesting to me. I'd known several of the people in the music hall acts and so on, and it was very, very interesting indeed.
One outstanding memory I've got was in 1940. It was on the 24th of March. I remember the date, it was my birthday. I was playing the Hippodrome at Brighton. I got down on Monday morning, ready to rehearse with the band, and there on the stage I saw something I'd never seen before in a theatre. 2 men fixing a billiard table. And I thought, well, if they're going to let us play billiards between the houses, this is ridiculous. But it was Joe Davis making his very first appearance on any stage anywhere. And I was intrigued. Thought, well, how are the audience in the stalls going to see a man play a game of snooker? And then down came a huge mirror, the whole size of the billiard table, and the audience in the stalls could see the reflection in the mirror. Well, it was all set up, all the teething troubles of fitting had been got over. Came the first house, and I was very anxious to see what Joe Davis was going to do, because Joe was a man I had admired. Here was a world champion with no opposition at all. Nobody had a chance of taking his title away from him, and that's something England's, I don't think we've ever had it before. And the only way that Joe got rid of his title as the world champion snooker player was to retire. So I'm standing on the side, up goes the curtain, on comes Joe. Mind you, this is the first time he's been on the stage. The lights are facing him. He's got this mirror behind him. Goes to make his first shot, misses. Second shot, he misses. Third time, now the audience are beginning to get a little restless. And I dashed on the stage and said, excuse me, where can we get hold of your brother Fred? Well, he's got a laugh, and off I ran. He started again. Same thing happened, he missed again. And back I ran and said, Joe, I think you're using the wrong coloured chalk. Eventually, the third time, and I stopped him, said, ladies and gentlemen, Don't take any notice of Mr. Joe Davis. It's the first time he's been on the stage. Unfortunately, he's been talking to the acrobats. And the acrobat said, if you miss 2 or 3 times, when you eventually do it, the trick will go enormous. And he's been taking it seriously. Well, it became a double act between Joe Davis and myself, and he was the highest paid stooge I ever had. By about Wednesday, Joe had mastered this, the reflection of the mirror, where he saw his arm moving when he was going to make a stroke. And he was really fantastic. So then I was able to run on, because we'd made this part of the act, by saying, what do they call this game, Joe? And he said, this is snooker. I said, really? Well, what is it that I play? Doesn't look anything like this. Well, our paths crossed many times. We went to Blackpool, to the Opera House, and eventually Joe absolutely hit the peak, the London Palladium, the Shangri-La of all music hall performers.
Joe and I met at the Palladium. Before the show went on, actually. I was, I think, playing around, rehearsing my bits on the table, and saw this very attractive girl there. Didn't realize at the time that one day I might marry her. That's where we first met. That was 1940. But it took me some time, because it was 45 before I was able to get her into the net, you see.
Well, when I was taken backstage to meet Joe, I shouldn't be saying this, but I wasn't in the least interested, although I believe he was. But our paths kept crossing for the next, this was in 1940 that I met him, and for the next 5 years he went back to touring the clubs, and I was touring the music halls. Sometimes our paths would meet, Sheffield, Leeds, Manchester or something, but I still wasn't interested. And it was in 1945. I played pantomime at the Alexandra Theatre in Birmingham. And Joe had been sort of half following me around all these years without me even bothering to look at him. And we played about 16 or 18 weeks. And every Saturday we played 3 shows, one at 10:30 in the morning. And every Saturday the chorus would come off and they'd say, he's there, he's out in front. And I said, what, again? And he would come every Saturday and stay the weekend. So after about, I don't know how many weeks of this, I decided it must be love. So I said yes. And funnily enough, we got married before the end of the run in Birmingham.
1946 was the most exciting snooker championship in which I ever played. I played Horace Lindrum, the Australian nephew of Walter Lindrum, and we played at the Royal Horticultural Hall, Vincent Square. It was a terrific organisation we had behind the whole thing, and it was highly successful. I was fortunate enough to win it, but I'd been through the process so many times, I thought I'd held the title long enough, 20 years, and I then decided to retire from championship play. There is the trophy. Yes, 1927 was the first time it was played. A fellow named Davis, Joe Davis, won it. And there seems to be 1 or 2 other Davises on there. I suppose it was all Joe Davis. But that was the trophy, and it's still played for by these present-day players.
Joe kept the title for 20 years and retired the great champion, and I can't see anyone today equaling or getting anywhere near that record. I think I've done well to keep it for 4 years, actually. In fact, when it was first started again way back in '69 or thereabouts, and I think John Spencer won it on that occasion, and we were discussing it afterwards, after the tournament in the dressing room, and I always remember making a comment, and I said, well, whoever wins it today won't keep it for long. But I can't see anyone keeping it very long, and there's no chance of anyone equaling his record.
I came into the game as a professional in 1952, and Joe was very good to me then, because he took a lot of interest and gave me coaching, and I was very fortunate, really, to get this at an early age, coming into the professional ranks. And of course I had the opportunity of playing against Joe for a few years, because at the old famous Leicester Square Hall, it closed in 1955, so I had 3 or 4 years there as a professional, playing with Joe and watching him and being struck by the tremendous ability that he had and the artistry that he showed on the table.
Well, of course, he had a tremendous aura about him. He was, of course, the complete professional player. Not only had he extreme talent, he'd got showmanship, personality, tremendous business acumen, and he towered above everybody else in the game to such an extent that, although there were 1 or 2 of us, and particularly myself being young, you know, you have a bit of a go when you're young, but I'm sure that most of the players of that time were virtually beaten before they started playing with him, because he was so overpowering that he put everybody else in the shade.
We, in our days together at Leicester Square, we opened in October 1946, and it closed in January 1955. And during those years, I learnt so much from this terrific personality, this dominant character in the world of snooker, and not only in the world of snooker, but in the world of sport in general.
Well, it was January the 22nd, 1955, when I was faced with this problem on the snooker table. I thought I was heading for the maximum break, which I'd been hoping to get for well over 30 years. But I found myself in this almost impossible position. As you will see here, the only shot to play, I'd taken or potted 13 of the reds, and I'd taken a black with each of them. And of course, it's necessary to make the maximum, you must take a black with every red. So this was the trouble I was in. So the only shot possible here was to pot this red into this corner pocket. At the same time, keeping position on the black for the next one. Well, I don't suppose I could ever. I then took the black, went up to the final red, and then another black, and took all the colours. And that constituted the 147.
There's really only Joe Davis could have done such a thing, but it was a delightful thing. In the News of the World, they had Smith standing there, white-faced and in suffering. But believe me, I did not suffer. I was very pleased that Joe made this break, and it's a climax to my career, because I have not played since.
There are so many things about Joe, apart from his ability on the snooker table. The many wonderful things he's done for up-and-coming snooker players. The many things he's done for charity.
The great thing I admired about Joe was, in conjunction with Arthur Dixon Wright, the great surgeon, he used to run charity shows in aid of the Cancer Research Fund. And Joe raised literally thousands of pounds. He used to con all the snooker players, he used to con the actors, and every year, one of the shows he used to do was at the Cafe Royal. We used to have this exhibition of the comedians playing the snooker players, and the snooker players used to use for cues things like umbrellas, broom handles, wear boxing gloves. They still won. And he used to play the comedians. We had quite a few comedians in those days who were very good snooker players. People like Teddy Knox of Nervo and Knox, Clarkson Rose, even Sam Mayo in the old days. But Joe used to have an auction selling things. I used to sell them for him. And this went on year after year, and he used to go all around the country, and I would say, without exaggeration, he raised hundreds of thousands of pounds for the Cancer Research Fund.
The charities grew to astronomical figures. I remember the last 10 years of it, it was something like £20,000 per show, all helped for by the different snooker players, but originated from the pen of Joe Davis. And I think it's out of that, really, that he got his OBE, and very well deserved.
to go to Buckingham Palace to receive the OB. It was a tremendous thrill. That was, I should say, probably the greatest thrill of all put together. Her Majesty was very kind. I was introduced by the Lord Chamberlain, introduced as Mr. Joseph Davis. When I got to Her Majesty, she said, I should think you'd barely remember or know yourself being called Joseph. Because I'd always known as Joe, as you know, Joe. Anyway, she was very kind and said a few words to me and hoped she'd see me playing on television again.
He was an ambassador of the sport and one of the finest there's ever been. You just can't say enough about Joe Davis as a man on the table. I think most players are frightened of him.
Playing against Joe was very difficult. Joe never seemed to worry about his opponents. This was one of the great things about him, the tremendous confidence that he had in his own ability. And his opponents were always very worried because they always felt that if they made a mistake, Joe was waiting there in the background to pounce on the table and clear the table. And it always affected the opponent's play. They never played as well against Joe as they did against other players. And Joe just never seemed to worry about his opponent. He just went on and played as though his opponent wasn't there.
Joe is a man of many, many characters, a fabulous man, and in my opinion, one of the greatest sportsmen this country's ever produced.
Well, my autobiography, yes. Well, that gave me great pleasure, a great lot of fun. Looking back over the days, taking my thoughts back in my press cuttings to see the things when I started, and I've got several of the press cuttings now. It tells me that I did make a break of 100 when I was 12 years of age. And the cuttings also, which proved that I won the local amateur championship. And so it went through my life. I loved it, I enjoyed it. I worked very hard, worked very, very hard indeed. But it was a labor of love, just the same. I finally enjoyed, of course, missed playing in pot black in colour. I missed that terribly. Very glad to say that I've been able to come and see much of it here. And I think the present-day players are absolutely marvellous.
Well, Joe, apart from coming here and watching the games being played and making the presentations, you may well recall this particular moment when we met in this very studio 2 years ago.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have now an award which is quite unique as far as pot black is concerned, because it's a special award of our own. It's an award to a gentleman who, because he is so great at the game, over so many years, has made himself a fantasy, a living legend amongst millions and millions of snooker players. And so it's my pleasure, on behalf of everyone here in Pot Black, both the backroom boys upstairs, around the viewing public and the players, to present Mr. Joe Davis with this replica of the Pot Black Trophy in sort of recognition of your great services to the game and, of course, to this program as well.
Thank you very, very much.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good night. Well, I'm very, very happy indeed. This is a great surprise and a great pleasure, something that I shall treasure for all the rest of my life.